really simple stock reconstructions with them. If we knew what happened to the stock, right, and we have the catch, we just kind of add everything back up under some assumptions about what's been going on in terms of the fishing pressure that's been exerted on that. And so here we go from light fishing pressure up to heavy fishing pressure, and we're really plotting what we all care about, hopefully, is the stock recruitment function. How does that relative improvement in juvenile or recruit survival change as we fish things up and down? And so across these range of, well, we think we were hitting that pretty hard or not very lightly, we reconstruct what that stock recruit relationship looks like out there. The relationship between spawning potential and recruits out there. And this gives us an interesting insight. And this is just a simple number dynamics model that we use for it. But what this tells us, right, before even running a stock assessment, is the potential range given the patterns that were in the data that we might see in terms of the stock recruitment relationship. So if we go across any one of these lines, we can say, okay, let's take a look at the orange curve here. It's the Beverton-Holt, and this compensation ratio parameter, or steepness, which measures how strong these stocks can push back against impacts. You know, this is going from basically 1, or flat, all the way up to infinite. So it's going straight line to flat top curve. And that tells us something really interesting. It says, well, hang on, there's no information in that pattern whatsoever. I can fit any sort of production relationship, right, given any other set of parameters that I throw into here. So there's nothing for any sort of algorithm to bite into. Whereas if we look at some of these other ones here, like blue marlin, it's going from 2 up to about 10. And so there's a fairly well-defined pattern in that data that an algorithm can, it may be the wrong pattern, but it's a pattern that an algorithm can bite into. So if we kind of look through that stuff, we come up with this problem for large pelagics. So it turns out that 17 of the 24 stocks that we're interested in, that relative abundance pattern tells us nothing about what happened to the stock. It's uninformative. And that puts us in a scary place, and it puts us in a place where we're with, for most of the fisheries in the Gulf of Mexico as well, and in the South Atlantic, and in most of the places in the world. It's that the relative abundance indices tend not to be informative, okay? And we tend, when we look at what additional information we need to add or gather for those fisheries, it can be about the scale, how big that population is, or how productive that population is. And this becomes a really useful map to say, hang on, this means whatever additional data I bring into a stock assessment, right, about scale or productivity is going to have an incredibly strong impact about the inferences that I make. And we tend to bring in composition, right? Proportions at age, proportions at size, right? Rarely do we have tagging. So it tends to be these composition data that we bring in, which means not only do we have to understand our relative abundance series well, if it's uninformative, we have to understand the nature of the additional information. So it means we have to understand selectivity, right? Or it has to be estimable, or we have to have some reference points for all of that we understand. And so it's a really kind of worthwhile exercise to move through in terms of understanding how data is influencing the output of stock assessments for these fisheries. So then we can take it a step further. How am I doing? All right, you're almost going to make me shut up. Okay. So we can do that recruitment reconstruction spatially, because we have information for each one of these little spatial cells. And so we just build up its little recruitment history. We add the catch back in on each one of those cells. And suddenly we get a bunch of cells where it says, well, given the catch that came out of this cell, you have a negative population size. This is not possible. It makes no sense. And then you say, well, let's just borrow a few little fish from over here. And we'll just shove them in there. And then it says, well, you can't do that because now you can't explain. And they say, well, we'll just take them from down here. And we'll shove them in down over here. And so you start to create these fields of apparent movement rates that explain the imbalance between the recruitment and the catch in those areas. So just simple flow in, flow out type models. And of course, what those look like depends upon what you assume about how things move around. So tunas, cosmopolitan species on the ocean. If you look at, for a number of those species, John Hampton, John Seibert had a paper that came out and they were like, these things don't move much. Maybe 300 nautical miles in their lifetime for skipjack and yellowfin, right? Really low movement rates. Whereas if you know anything about kind of adolescent Pacific bluefin tuna, they can be hanging off surfing on California, looking at sea lions, and then they're like, oh my God, I gotta go to Japan. And then 3 weeks later, they're in Japan. So, you know, that influences not only the nature of these flows, but then the resulting apparent recruitment field that you generate from him. So if you have low movement, you kind of get this broad, diffuse recruitment field. And if you have very high movement, you start to get these recruitment hotspots. And depending on the movement rate of your organism and what you understand about that, it will depend on what you set up. But once we have this, and we have this, then we can create this, which is some distribution of that organism out there. So now we have a spatially explicit population dynamics model that allows us to figure out where recruitment is coming in and how things are moving, and these are equilibrium unfished distributions of that. And so we do it across all our stocks. And so we get this picture to play with. It's missing some species, but I couldn't fit them all on. But now we can say, okay, this is what 1950 oceans look like prior to fishing. And these are the distribution of the species out there. And here's the hotspots. Here's our black marlin hotspot, right? Southern bluefin tuna hotspots. And they kind of match. If you can remember that initial catch distribution out there, it kind of matches up with this. And you're like, oh, wow, I believe I'm doing everything right. And I have full faith in my model. Trust me. But we got to ask some neat questions about this. We can say, well, how would I fish and manage this? So let's run off these initial conditions and ask some interesting questions. So if this kind of, we sum up all those maps together and give everything a dollar value out there, we get initial distribution of the potential value of that fishing resource out there, right? We can then take a look at where the tuna and marlin richest hotspots fall in. So where do we have strong species overlaps that we might be concerned with? We can also, here's kind of our recruitment field of everything. This one, where am I going here? This is the initial, this is the most recent, I think this is 2000, average 2000s effort distribution that was fishing, that resulted from fishing this. So this is your kind of your reference effort distribution for the Japanese fleet, or the global fleet out there, sorry, the global fleet. And then we can play with notions about cost. So this is saying we find out where all the major global ports are, and we say, well, this is the relative cost to get to that fishing point. Or we can say, you can make this uniform, you can play with that cost field if you want. And then we can say, okay, go out and fish it. And I want you to fish it, and I want you to maximize your profits, right? Because that's the only optimization we can do. We can't optimize for other things very easily. So we make our, you turn an algorithm use, or for each cell you make your marginal cost equal your marginal revenue in terms of profit optimizations. And you say, okay, what's going on here? How would you fish this given that objective? And we get these little dots here. And it says, I don't fish there ever. That site doesn't even generate profit. It says the only reason you saw effort there ever was probably some exploratory fishing. Then they saw nothing, or it wasn't worth their while, and they never fished there again. So you get a bunch of these areas that say, we would never put fishing effort there because they don't generate any profit. The rest of the cells would generate profit, but the black cells are the ones that this super manager says, I'm not going to put fishing effort there, because if I did, it would wreck the profit that I would generate. And so you get this mosaic of effort distributions out to say, this is how I would distribute effort, given the movement patterns and the productivity of all these stocks, to maximize my profit. And then you say, well, how well did we do? So the blue bars say we're actually under our target, and the target here is FMSY. The stars are the estimated effort that was being exerted on those, or the fishing mortality rate that was being exerted on those stocks roughly in the mid-2000s. Okay? And so we pull everything in a lot of places right on back. It says we're in the blue for all of these except for these stocks here. So black marlin, white marlin, striped marlin, blue marlin, blue marlin, blue marlin, and bluefin tuna because they're delicious. Right? So the marlins are getting wasted. That's basically what it says. Optimally, you would screw your marlins over anyways. But we can say, well, hang on, we don't want to do that because we love marlins, right? And we want them swimming in the ocean, and we want Papa Hemingway to be very excited about catching his big fish. And so we can take it a step further and say, well, let's put a constraint on there. Let's say, let's penalize you for actually going over these targets. So now everything has to be harvested at FMSY. What does that fishing distribution start to look at? Okay? And so this is kind of one of the mosaic patterns you get under the assumed cost field, under the assumed movement rates, et cetera, et cetera. But it's kind of a really interesting game to play. And what we find out from this, okay, is a significant portion of the world's oceans get closed. We focus fisheries on the recruitment hotspots or parent recruitment hotspots for your main target species. That is, however, completely dependent upon your assumptions about how things recruit. And I won't get into that this time, but we can talk about it later if you're interested, okay? So depending on the recruitment model that you're using, is it local or is it global recruitment in terms of egg creation, that affects this distribution as well. It happens to have very little to do with cost. Okay? And the biggest difference between this map and this map is you can see that effort is being pulled out of areas that have high species richness, or that high overlap between the species. You yank it out of there. We can also play this game and say, well, what if we come up with some innovative way of not catching marlin, since they're up in the surface layers in a lot of places, we drop the gear down below them, and you can reverse things back towards this picture here, right? So innovation can get you out of it. Okay. So, what did we learn? This is a killer, right? The spatial understanding, that spatial distribution, and how to account for how that fishery is interacting with that spatial distribution is imperative. Okay? And we have to spend a lot of time in terms of assessment thinking about it. We have to spend time thinking about how we fill in those areas that we didn't observe. Okay? Do we use the latest Thorson Gaussian fields out there? Do we do something else? Really be careful with AIC. Make sure you're using AIC for what you're supposed to be using AIC for. So, you know, it's great to telling you the model that is good for making the next prediction. It's not necessarily going to be good for creating the model for the question that you're actually asking. So make sure you have that clear in your head. This is a really worthwhile exercise. These simple reconstructions can tell us a lot. I remember Ray Hilborn going completely ballistic on the fact that if you take the Ryerson and Ram time series and you do a simple reconstruction, it makes no sense whatsoever. You can't explain the catch that came out later given the pattern of the fishery. So these can, you know, provide a lot. They seem pretty trivial, but they provide a lot of insight in terms of the influence of data out there. That kind of neat profit optimization really said reduce effort. You can solve most of the problem by reducing effort. And the number that comes out is about 40%, which is a really interesting number. Because if you talk to a lot of people about it, they're like, yeah, we're probably overcapitalized by 30 to 40% out there. And then if you talk a little bit about subsidies that go into those fisheries, you're like, yeah, that's probably another 10, 15%. So if these things were actually working in a free market system, it might look very different. Of course, you get increased profits because that's what you told it to do, but there is a benefit there. 30% of the ocean stays open. And it turns out that most of that is in the exclusive economic zones, which matches up with a number of some of the recent stuff that's come out on the high seas in terms of what would be the effect of closing the high seas. It has little effect in the Pacific. It has a greater effect in the Indian and the Atlantic Oceans. And then, really it's the effort reduction that drives the benefits from all of that. And there's a few tweaks you have to do in some of the more vulnerable species if you're interested in them. So in terms of moving forward, we're going to try and do this in the Gulf of Mexico for the reef fish stock. I have a student who's been working out there. But, here's our red snapper distribution from the observer data scattered across out there. And we've run, if you run through that observer data and you look at the CPUE time series out there, just because of the coverage of for some of the less targeted species, the coverage is poor. And you get these really jumpy relative abundance time series. And so I have a student, Nicola Ducharme-Barth, who's been working with the VMS data. And I know Steve has people working with the VMS data to try and come up with, given this VMS world, can we create a spatial distribution of kind of the effort of that VMS data? And then can we lay catch across on top of that to get some index of the species composition? And then can we run through this entire exercise for the 25 top species in that vertical line fishery in the Gulf of Mexico? And then start to play some of those neat games with, let's have an oil spill in terms of that, and let's have more. They generate lots of money. But if we have an oil spill here, we can run those optimizations and say, well, how would you optimally distribute that fleet, and how does that compare to what the fleet did, right? Or if we have increasing red tide blooms in some areas, how might that fleet distribute amongst them? So lots of fun things to play with once you get those working, and I think that's it. Enjoy.